They took our brains, we took their planet. Part 1. Welcome, cosmic explorers, to a galaxy of unfathomable wonders and equally unfathomable dangers. Tonight, we're diving into a tale that will challenge everything you thought you knew about intelligence, warfare, and just how terrifying a species can be when pushed to its primal limits. This is a story recounted by Ambassador Vorkus, a seasoned diplomat from the meticulous Kular species, whose evening of triumphant celebration was utterly ruined by his old friend, Dr. Xylos, a brilliant but now deeply, profoundly disturbed xenoscientist. The galactic comms buzzed with joyous broadcasts. Across 1,000 systems, from the glittering spires of the Orion Syndicate to the bustling trade hubs of the Nebula Nexus, the Coalition celebrated a monumental victory. The Xylar hegemony, a terrifying enemy whose cold, logical advance had brought countless civilizations to their knees, finally retreated. A vital planet, Viridia Prime, a world once lush with bioluminescent flora and crystalline rivers, had been liberated from their most horrific weapon, the neural inhibitor. This wasn't just any weapon, it was an insidious, silent killer of minds. It blanketed vast areas, severing all advanced technological connections, rendering starships inert, and, more chillingly, robbing sentient creatures of their higher cognitive functions. It turned brilliant minds into simple, unthinking beasts. It was the Xylar's ultimate psychological warfare, crushing resistance by turning foes into helpless, drooling masses. So, with Viridia Prime finally free, with the Xylar in full retreat, everyone should have been celebrating, right? Well, almost everyone. Because in a quiet, dimly lit corner of the Coalition's grand celebratory gala on the orbital station Concordia Nexus, Dr. Xylos, a lead researcher on a top-secret project devoted to finding a counter for this very inhibitor, was absolutely incandescent with rage. The air in the gala hall, usually filled with pleasant modulated chatter and the gentle clinking of celebratory nutrient paste dispensers, was suddenly pierced by a guttural roar. "Filthy, idiotic primates!" Dr. Xylos bellowed, slamming one of his heavy, segmented forelimbs onto the polished Durasteel table. The impact rattled every delicate glass, sent ripples through the expensive synth gel drinks, and caused nearby celebrants, a pair of nervous, multi-eyed Gurathi and a stoic, rock-skinned Gorok, to flinch back in alarm. Xylos's multi-jointed arms twitched with uncontrolled fury, his normally precise, calculating movements replaced by jerky, spastic gestures. It was a stark contrast to the usual calm, almost robotic precision expected of a Kular scientist. He was, to put it mildly, having a complete meltdown. Ambassador Vorkus, whose diplomatic duties included maintaining decorum at such high-profile events, and, frankly, trying to prevent his old friend from starting an interspecies brawl, carefully placed his own glowing, emerald-green nutrient paste cylinder on the table. He tried to project an air of calm that he certainly didn't feel. His Kular sensory antennae twitched slightly, picking up the rising tide of discomfort from the surrounding species. "Xylos, my friend," Vorkus began, his voice a low, soothing hum. "You are quite literally ruining the party. I've already received several subspace complaints from the Trillions about your volume. Today we drink to our hard-won victories, to the liberation of Viridia Prime, not scream about monkeys. What in the blazes is the problem that could possibly justify this display?" Dr. Xylos glared, his optical sensors narrowing to mere angry slits, reflecting the pulsating lights of the gala hall. He snatched his highly concentrated stimulant drink, a concoction so potent it would render most species catatonic, and took a long, furious pull. The dark, viscous liquid vanished down his throat with a gulp that sounded like grinding pebbles. "The problem, Vorkus," he spat, "is that we didn't find a countermeasure for the inhibitor. Not a single, solitary, effective countermeasure. Our life's work, our species' collective genius, all for nothing." Ambassador Vorkus could only stare, his usual diplomatic composure cracking under the sudden bewildering twist. His antennae drooped slightly. But we won, Xylos. The Xylar were driven off Viridia Prime. The inhibitor field has collapsed. So, by all accounts, you did beat the inhibitor, did you not?" Dr. Xylos slammed his now empty glass down with enough force to crack the table's Durasteel surface. A small web of fissures spread from the impact point. "No! We wasted 1526 cycles of tireless dedicated research. That's almost 3 standard centuries, Vorkus. 3 centuries of sleepless nights, countless simulations, theoretical breakthroughs, and dead ends. We squandered 13 billion coalition credits, enough to terraform a dozen lifeless asteroids. All that intellectual might, all that precious funding, all that time, only for those emitifying humans to show up, make an absolute mockery of everything we thought we knew about warfare and sentience, and then add insult to injury. Laugh at us. I saw the recordings, Vorkus. They were literally laughing. Vorkus leaned in further, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, his cooler curiosity now fully, irrevocably piqued. This was far more interesting than discussing interstellar trade routes. Humans? What do you mean, my friend? I haven't heard much about them, beyond their recent probationary admission into the coalition. They are a new addition to our esteemed alliance, yes? Barely part of our esteemed galactic union for 100 cycles, Xylos scoffed, waving a dismissive limb that narrowly missed Vorkus's snout. They joined, listened to our grand speeches about galactic harmony, and then kept to themselves mostly. Then, they heard about the Xylar War, the one that was literally devouring our territory sector by sector, and they sent a small fleet of what they called warriors to help out. A pathetic gesture, really. Of course, it was a drop in the bucket compared to the rest of the coalition fleet. We're talking hundreds of thousands of ships versus their, maybe 24 of those crude vessels. And their weapons? Don't even get me started on their weapons. Just variable speed rock shot from ships that don't even have energy shields. Can you believe it? Their primary defense seemed to be that their ships were so slow and clunky, nobody bothered wasting ordnance on them. But they sent some, quote, warriors. So we, being the kind, responsible, and frankly pitying coalition partners, warned them about the inhibitor field. We give them all the standard disclosures, the detailed schematics of the device, the known effects on hundreds of species, the evacuation protocols, the whole 9 parsecs. The humans, though? They just nodded with those oddly blank expressions and grunted a lot, didn't ask questions, didn't offer solutions, just grunted. Probably should have been a sign, looking back on it now. A cosmic warning sign I completely, stupidly, blissfully ignored. Dr. Xylos trailed off again, his multifaceted eyes fixating on some distant, unseen horror that seemed to hover just beyond the shimmering walls of the gala hall. He was reliving the nightmare, pixel by pixel. Ambassador Vorkus gently clicked his chitinous fingers together, creating a soft, rhythmic sound designed to draw his friend's attention back to the present, to the very real, very expensive stimulant drink that was surely still affecting Xylos's already frayed nerves. The primal battle, what happens when humans lose their higher brains, Part 2. Anyway, Dr. Xylos continued, his voice now a low, agitated growl, each word laced with a mixture of trauma and scientific outrage. They get to the front lines. Our analysts, of course, predicted they'd be cannon fodder. We'd lose a few ships, gather some data, and then politely suggest they stick to farming. And, of course, within a week, the unmistakable warning signs of the neural inhibitor activating over Viridia Prime began to pulse through our long-range sensors. We detected the signature, saw the energy buildup, confirming the Xylar were unleashing their ultimate weapon once more. So we, the intelligent, advanced species of the Coalition, immediately begin our full emergency evacuation process. Our sleek transport vessels swooped in, rescuing our troops, our scientists, anyone caught in the expanding field. We pull back our research vessels, point every sensor array we have towards the planet, hoping to gather more crucial research data, another tragic data point, to help us solve this horrific problem that has plagued us for centuries. The humans, they don't make it off-world. Too slow, too clumsy, too primitive to understand the urgency of a collapsing neural field. So we simply watch this newest, supposedly unsophisticated species, figuring this will be another devastating example. Perhaps the final, crucial data point for our research, confirming the inhibitor's universal effectiveness. Dr. Xylos paused, a full-body shudder running through his segmented body, as if trying to shake off an unseen miasma. The wave of distortion cleared. It swept over Viridia Prime, silent and invisible, doing its insidious work. The air itself seemed to crackle with suppressed thought. And what did we see on our real-time sensor feeds? The humans. Just standing around, staring at each other with those unblinking, unsettlingly empty eyes. Our remote optical sensors zoomed in, processing the raw data. We waited with bated breath. Would they scatter in mindless panic? fleeing in random directions? Would they simply graze mindlessly on the alien flora, becoming harmless, docile animals like the Cathar under neural suppression? Would they immediately turn on each other, devolving into savage infighting, as the notoriously aggressive Glorgax often do when their complex social structures collapse under neural inhibitors? Or would they go into deep, irreversible comas, like the fragile Braxturan species, who simply collapse into inert lumps when their higher functions are suppressed, never to awaken? We held our collective breath, our data recorders working overtime, processing every millisecond of this unprecedented observation, only for them to start grouping up and screaming at each other. Xylos's voice rose to a frantic pitch, his limbs flailing. It wasn't the panic of animals caught in a trap, Vorkus. It was something else. Something utterly, horrifyingly deliberate. There was immediate, violent shoving. They hit themselves with their own limbs. They hit others with brutal, clumsy force. It was utterly chaotic, a primal brawl, yet bizarrely, there was an underlying disturbing pattern. They were jostling, roaring, asserting dominance. And then, after a short while, perhaps 2.7 standard minutes, our logs confirmed, they settled down. Not calmed down, mind you, but settled into an uneasy, growling truce. Still occasionally screaming and making bizarre, guttural noises that defied our linguistic algorithms, sounds that seemed to come from the deepest, most ancient parts of their biology. It took us an embarrassingly long time, cycles even, to realize they had somehow, in their supposedly disabled state, formed coherent social groups and re-established rough hierarchies based on their previous unit organization. They were acting like a disciplined, organized pack of apex predators. Ambassador Vorkus tilted his head, his confusion deepening into a profound sense of unease. He could feel a cold dread creeping into his very essence. But how did they? Xylos, you said their higher functions were suppressed. How could they possibly be communicating or organizing? That requires complex thought processes. Dr. Xylos slammed all four of his powerful forelimbs against the table again, the sound echoing through the suddenly quiet section of the gala, drawing stares from across the hall. They were communicating, Vorkas, he bellowed, his voice cracking with exasperation. The hooting and hollering and guttural screaming wasn't random noise. Our analysis confirmed it was complex, if utterly primitive, communication. It contained basic concepts of dominance, territory, and intent. No higher brain function, supposedly wiped clean by the inhibitor, and yet there they were, somehow talking to each other, sharing information, coordinating. And then, to make matters worse, one of them, a stocky male in heavy scorched armor, ends up running full force into a jagged piece of fallen Xylar debris with his boot. It made a loud, resonant clang, and Vorkus, he finds the sound funny. He actually laughs, a loud, booming, utterly horrifying sound that reverberated through our comms. The other humans, drawn by this bizarre spectacle, gather around, their empty eyes widening, and they also start making funny sounds. Soon, they're in groups, slamming armor, banging rocks, mimicking each other, competing at making the best, loudest, most ear-splitting funny sounds. Which, I suppose to them, might as well be music and culture at that point, given their devolved state. They found joy in primordial noise. Ambassador Vorkus just seemed even more baffled, rubbing his sensory antennae nervously. He was starting to wish he was back in his quarters, completely sober, and far, far away from this disturbing revelation. This was making less and less sense. Dr. Xylos, now pacing wildly around the small booth, continued his furious rant. Then, drawn by the sheer incomprehensible cacophony of these funny sounds, the Xylar hegemony forces show up on the surface of Viridia Prime. They were still conducting their post-inhibitor sweep, expecting nothing but inert life forms. They send out a small ground patrol, 4 of their elite infantry, armed with plasma rifles and suppression fields. Their lead commandant, a notoriously cruel Xylar named Cathar, being the logical, aggressive species they are, approaches a group of humans engaged in a particularly loud, funny sound competition. He raises his plasma blade, figuring a quick, decisive action will scare them off and solve the noise pollution problem, re-establish order. Dr. Xylos slammed his fist down again, the sound now sickeningly familiar, echoing the crack in the table. Instead, Vorkus, the stupid ape, the one Xylar Cathar had just stabbed, looks down at the smoking blade sticking out of his chest, a fresh burn mark on his armor. Then, with an oddly deliberate motion, he reaches down and touches the glowing tip of the blade with a finger, as if he's too dumb to even realize what is happening. All the humans stop making their noises. There's a momentary, chilling, unnatural silence across the entire region, broken only by the hum of the Xylar patrol's armor. Then, the injured human, his face contorted into something ancient and terrifying, lets out a scream. A primal, guttural shriek that seemed to come from the very core of his being, a sound that chilled us to the bone even through the filtered sensor feeds. And then the injured human, with a single brutal, unthinking motion, punches the Xylar commandant, a direct, skull-shattering impact that sent the Xylar soldier flying. The primal battle. What happens when humans lose their higher brains? Part 3. This, of course, Dr. Xylos continued, his voice now a strained whisper of horror, causes every other human in the vicinity to scream, that same chilling primal shriek, and then charge the Xylar. They didn't have weapons, Vorkus. Not proper, advanced coalition-issued weapons. They were unarmed. They proceeded to beat the Xylar soldiers to death with their bare, simian fists, tearing their limbs off with horrifying, almost surgical efficiency. Our sensor feeds showed Xylar armor being peeled back like fruit skins, revealing the soft, vulnerable organs beneath. Several of them were spotted using rocks they'd torn from the ground, and even shattered pieces of Xylar tech as makeshift clubs. One manages to pick up a jagged piece of rock, and with surprising accuracy and brute force, throws it hard enough to put a hole straight through a Xylar's armored head, spraying dark Icarus fluid across the landscape. So of course the others also immediately start throwing rocks, abandoning their fists, mimicking the successful action, competing to see who could throw the best, most lethal rock. Dr. Xylos, completely flustered and seemingly beyond rational thought, snatched Ambassador Vorkus's untouched, glowing stimulant drink and chugged it down in one desperate gulp, ignoring Vorkus's startled protest. Then, for reasons I sincerely hope I never, ever understand for the sake of my sanity, they start eating the Xylar. Yes, Vorkus, eating them, raw. Our thermal sensors registered consumption. In multiple cases, Vorkus, the Xylar was still alive, still screaming, still twitching, as these feral apes began consuming them. Our comms channels were flooded with the most horrific, desperate screams from the Xylar ground forces, followed by wet, tearing sounds. This went on until some of the humans started getting visibly sick from the alien biology, collapsing in retching piles. And then, mercifully, and with a horrifying pragmatism, they all stopped eating them, turning their attention elsewhere, searching for a different, less sickening food source. If Ambassador Vorkus had tried to think any harder at that moment, to process the sheer, mind-bending horror and absurdity of it all, to reconcile this primitive savagery with the species that built Alexandria and traded in complex philosophical texts, he might have started to hemorrhage from the sheer mental strain. His head throbbed. But that's tool use and pattern recognition, Xylos. That's complex behavior. That requires a level of cognitive function that should be utterly suppressed by the neural inhibitor. How is that possible without higher functions? Dr. Xylos groaned, slumping back against the booth's padded wall, his composure utterly shattered, his voice a defeated, hollow mumble. Exactly! That's what defies every single one of my 1,500 cycles of research. The humans then, still under the inhibitor's field, formed highly aggressive territorial gangs. They didn't just survive, Vorkus. They began systematically hunting down and killing any Xylar they could find on the planet, plus anything else they deemed a threat or a viable food source. They cleared out entire sectors of Xylar patrols. We, of course, started desperately questioning and scanning the humans with every instrument we had, even sending automated probes down to get closer readings, trying to figure out what could possibly be going on. Our advanced neural scanners consistently registered only basic primal brain activity, aggression, hunger, social bonding, yet their actions were shockingly effective. They were winning the ground war without thinking. Only for the human leader, a large scarred male covered in Xylar blood and a crude rock shard necklace, to look directly at the primary comms probe, make weird, oddly captivating yet undeniably primitive hand motions, and say, and I quote, "Ape together strong." As if that made sense to a logical, intelligent being like myself. Dr. Xylos pushed his personal comm slate, still showing blurry, horrifying sensor footage of the chaos on Viridia Prime across the table to Ambassador Vorkus. When we finally managed to establish rudimentary communication with the other humans through their unit-level comms, once they somehow learned to mimic basic functions like receive signal and transmit simple data, they just kept sending us these things called memes. You know, those random, nonsensical images with text overlays. And they'd transmit guttural noises while saying things like return to monkey. They were sending memes Vorkas while butchering an advanced alien military. Meanwhile, the Xylar, the same species that developed this horrific mind-killing inhibitor, were suddenly frantic. Their entire planetary command structure went into a panic. They were frantically turning off their own planet-wide neural field. Why? Not to re-engage us, Vorkus? No. It was so they could use their ship's primary FTL drives to get off Viridia Prime and flee. They were so utterly existentially terrified of these feral primates that they abandoned their own powerful weapon, their own strategic advantage, their entire invasion plan, just to escape them. Ambassador Vorkus let out a strangled chuckle, a sound halfway between amusement and deep existential dread. The celebration's joyous sounds suddenly seemed incredibly hollow. He was drunk enough now, thanks to Xylos, to find the sheer cosmic absurdity of it all genuinely funny, without truly understanding any of it. He pictured a Xylar commander screaming into his comm, "Turn it off! Turn it all off! They're eating the troops! For the love of all that is logical, turn it off!" We cannot process this. The thought was terrifying, yet morbidly amusing. So, Vorkus mused aloud, his voice slightly slurred, if they don't use their higher brain power for communication, for forming complex social groups, for advanced cooperation, or for sophisticated tool use, what do they use it for, Xylos? What is this higher brain function that the inhibitor supposedly removes, if all these basic functions remain? Dr. Xylos slumped even further down, his head thudding softly against the wall of the booth, a sound of utter defeat and intellectual surrender. His voice was a defeated, haunted mumble, barely audible over the distant party noise. I asked the human leader that exact question, Vorkus. Why do you need higher functions if you can accomplish all this without it? What is it for? He paused, then shuddered. The human just sort of shrugged, and then he said, with those unsettlingly clear, empty eyes, suffering, mostly. Ambassador Vorkus stared down into his now empty glass, the celebration's joyous sounds a distant, meaningless hum, completely overwhelmed by the horror of Xylos's revelation. He mused aloud, mostly to himself. They're a pretty new species to the Coalition, aren't they? Barely 100 cycles. And they jumped right into an advanced interstellar war with a horrific, mind-altering weapon, like the neural inhibitor. Xylos, are we absolutely sure they actually have higher brain function at all? Or is this just their default state, their true terrifying nature, only slightly less brutalized by higher thought? Dr. Xylos let out a long, tortured groan, a sound that conveyed centuries of wasted research, shattered assumptions, and the crushing weight of a galactic civilization's profound misunderstanding of a single infuriating species. That is what I've been screaming this whole time, Vorkus. That is precisely the question that is driving me to the brink of neural collapse. And then, Vorkus, the ultimate indignity. The human fleet admiral, the leader of these particular Marines, a term they use for their frontline shock troops, apparently had the gall to look at me during the post-mission briefing, with a perfectly straight face, devoid of any irony, and say, they're Marines. If they needed brain power, we'd issue it to them. As if higher cognition was just another piece of standard-issue gear. Can you believe the absolute audacity? Dr. Xylos finally slammed his head on the table with a dull, hollow thud, a sound of utter defeat that echoed the demise of his entire research project. I want my 1,500 cycles back, Vorkus. I want my 13 billion credits back. And I want to go home and forget I ever met you, you damn dirty apes. His voice trailed off into a series of pained guttural growls. And so, my friends, that is the tale of the Battle of Viridia Prime. A tale not of technology defeating technology, but of something far older, far more primal, and infinitely more terrifying. It's the story of how the galaxy learned a profound, unsettling truth. You can try to take a human's brain, but you can never take away their inner ape. And sometimes, that's all they need to win. They took our brains. We took their planet. Part 4. The galactic comms, usually a beacon of order and precise military reports, were a swirling chaos of panicked Xylar transmissions. Dr. Xylos had just finished his furious, broken account of humanity's primal victory on Viridia Prime. Ambassador Vorkus, still reeling, felt a chill that transcended the cool, regulated air of the gala hall. The celebration, once vibrant, now seemed distant, a mocking backdrop to the dark truths his friend had just unveiled. He stared at the cracked table, a physical manifestation of Xylos's shattered sanity. "So," Vorkus finally managed, his voice a low hum. "The Xylar, they abandoned the planet. Their most potent weapon, designed to incapacitate the mind, proved utterly useless against a species that, apparently, doesn't even need its higher functions to operate a crude but effective fighting force. This is unprecedented. What happened next, Xylos? Surely the humans didn't just stay there, making funny noises and eating fallen enemies?" Dr. Xylos, lifting his head from the table with a pained groan, wiped a bit of spilled stimulant liquid from his optical sensors. His segmented limbs trembled slightly. "Oh no, Vorkus. It got worse. Much, much worse." The Xylar, in their hasty, terrified retreat, left behind a vast amount of their sophisticated military equipment. Dropships, energy generators, even some smaller single-pilot fighters. All useless, of course, while the neural inhibitor was active. But the moment they deactivated the field, and you could practically feel the ripple of released mental energy even from orbit, the humans, they changed. Not back to their original, intelligent selves, mind you. No, they became something entirely different. Xylos leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, as if sharing a terrible secret. "Our sensors, after calibrating for the sudden influx of complex brain activity, showed a surge, a terrifying, exponential surge in their cognitive functions. They didn't just regain their higher brains, they seemed to be operating at a level that was accelerated. Their primal instincts, honed by the inhibitor, suddenly had the full computational power of a sentient species behind them. Imagine, Vorkus, if the most effective, most brutal apex predator on a death world suddenly gained the ability to strategize and innovate at a genius level while still retaining its insatiable primal drives." Ambassador Vorkus swallowed, a dry clicking sound in his throat. This was a nightmare. What did they do? They adapted, Vorkus, with terrifying speed. Within a few hours of the inhibitor field going down, those same, quote, feral apes who were throwing rocks and eating Xylar started examining the abandoned Xylar equipment. Our surveillance showed one human attempting to bite through the reinforced plasma casing of a dropped energy rifle. When that didn't work, he tried smashing it with a rock. Still didn't work. But then, another human, a female, observed this, picked up a discarded Xylar maintenance tool, and used it to pry open a service panel on the rifle. This was seconds after the field dropped. And then, a third human, a younger one, reached in, bypassed the internal safeties, and activated the rifle. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't logical. It was pure, unadulterated, instinctual problem-solving, combined with a terrifying capacity for rapid learning. Dr. Xylos shuddered again. Soon, they weren't just using rocks. They were fumbling with plasma rifles, figuring out how to fire them, often pointing them in wildly unsafe directions, sometimes even at each other. There were numerous friendly fire incidents in those initial hours, many fatal, but it didn't seem to deter them. They just learned from the mistakes. A group would learn how to pilot a Xylar dropship by trial and error, crashing half a dozen in the process, only for the seventh to actually get airborne. And then, they'd immediately turn it towards the fleeing Xylar forces still in the upper atmosphere, pelting them with unguided plasma blasts. It was like watching a child pick up a loaded firearm, terrifyingly effective, because they didn't understand the danger, only the immediate goal. Make big boom, hurt enemy. They started using the Xylar's own comm systems too, Xylos continued, his voice now a strained whisper. Not for diplomatic hails, no. Our intercepts picked up raw, unencrypted transmissions. Found a shiny shooty thing. This one makes a bigger hole. More food this way. Go, go, go! It was pure, unfiltered, primal thought, combined with terrifying technological adaptability. They were still acting like apes, Vorkas, but now they were apes with plasma guns and dropships. Ambassador Vorkas rubbed his sensory antennae, trying to process the implications. So they went from primitive savagery to weaponizing advanced alien tech in a matter of hours? Without any formal training? This defies all known biological and technological development models. Exactly. Xylos slammed his empty glass on the table again, a fresh crack appearing. My research, Vorkas, my entire career was built on the premise of logical, incremental technological advancement. This was an anomaly. A monstrous credit-eating anomaly. But it wasn't just the Xylar tech. Their own variable speed rocks, those crude projectiles they launched from their ships, suddenly became terrifyingly accurate. They integrated their primitive targeting systems with salvaged Xylar sensors. They were taking something they understood fundamentally, throwing rocks really hard, and applying advanced calculus to it without even realizing it. The Xylar, already panicked, reported waves of these primitive yet hyper-adaptive humans chasing them through the system, often in damaged, jury-rigged Xylar craft, still firing those variable speed rocks, but now with a precision that was truly alarming. They were like a swarm of angry, unthinking wasps, armed with starship-grade weapons. It was less a strategic pursuit and more a vengeful, instinctual hunt. Ambassador Vorkas grimaced. And this is why the Xylar agreed to reparations, even through a drone. Because they were being hunted by a species that was effectively a technological, primal force? Precisely, Xylos confirmed, a bitter taste in his voice. The Xylar Queen, through the drone, revealed the truth. Her swarms, massive as they were, relied on centralized command and logical, long-term strategy. The humans, operating on pure instinct and rapid, chaotic adaptation, were an unknown variable she couldn't account for. They didn't think like a strategic enemy. They thought like a force of nature, an enraged, territorial force of nature that just got its hands on plasma cannons. The Xylar literally couldn't comprehend how to fight them. Their logical war simulations crashed and burned every time a feral human variable was introduced. It was like trying to outsmart a localized supernova with a calculus equation. Impossible. Xylos sighed, a sound of profound intellectual exhaustion. The drone also hinted at something else, Vorkas. Something about the humans' instinctive joy in destruction. It mentioned that after they finished with the Xylar remnants on Viridia Prime, they started optimizing the planet itself. We initially thought they were cleaning up, perhaps terraforming. But our long-range sensors picked up massive energy signatures. They weren't building, they were deconstructing. With a terrifying zeal, they were taking apart Xylar bases, natural rock formations, anything that stood in their way of... What? We still don't know. And then came the comms from Alexandria, Xylos continued, leaning his head back against the booth. Their colony, remember? The one that welcomed all species? Apparently, a small delegation of humans who hadn't been on Viridia Prime during the inhibitor incident arrived. They heard about what happened. And they sent us a message. Not of apology, not of explanation, but of an offer. Ambassador Vorkas raised an antenna. An offer? After all this? Yes, Xylos said, his voice now a strained, almost hysterical whisper. They offered to send more Marines, but only if we promised them more Xylar for training exercises. And they kept sending those damn memes and return-to-monkey messages. It was like they were proud of it, proud of their primal savagery. I tell you, Vorkas, they are not a species to be understood by logic. They are a force to be observed from a very, very safe distance. Vorkas stared at his friend, then at the empty glasses, and finally out into the celebrating hall. The music seemed jarringly loud, the laughter hollow. He had come to stop a riot, but he felt like one was brewing inside his own mind. The galaxy had just defeated a technologically superior foe, not with ingenuity, but with sheer, unthinking, terrifying savagery. And the architects of that savagery were now asking for more targets. Perhaps, Vorkas murmured, mostly to himself, perhaps some victories are best left unexamined. He shuddered. I need another drink, Xylos, a much stronger one. And then, perhaps, a very long, very deep nap, one from which I hope to awaken with my understanding of the universe intact. Doctor. Xylos, however, was already back to mumbling, his head once again resting on the table amidst the cracks. Damn apes, Where's my 1500 cycles? And so, my friends, that is the extended tale of the Battle of Viridia Prime. A tale not of technology defeating technology, but of something far older, far more primal, and infinitely more terrifying. It's the story of how the galaxy learned a profound, unsettling truth. You can try to take a human's brain, but you can never take away their inner ape. And sometimes, that's all they need to win. And then some. Beware the species that finds its greatest strength in the absence of thought. They took our brains. We took their planet. Part 5. Ambassador Vorkus stared at his friend, Dr. Xylos, slumped over the table, muttering about lost cycles and wasted credits. The words, suffering, mostly, echoed in Vorkus's mind, a chilling whisper from the very depths of humanity's strange psyche. The gala music, once a symbol of triumph, now felt like a desperate attempt to drown out the unsettling truth that had just been revealed. The galaxy had won, yes, but how? And at what cost to its understanding of sanity? So, Vorkus began, pushing his now truly empty glass away. The Xylar fled. They left Viridia Prime to the humans. What happened after that, Xylos? Did the humans recover? Did they return to their previous level of, shall we say, conventional intelligence? Dr. Xylos slowly lifted his head, his multifaceted eyes bloodshot. A faint trail of nutrient paste clung to one of his mandibles. Recover? Vorkus, you simply don't understand. They didn't recover in the way we'd expect. They didn't go back to being the quaint species that built impressive, if somewhat baffling, colonies like Alexandria. They evolved. Or perhaps devolved. It's a matter of philosophical debate among the few xenoscientists brave enough to even touch this data. He picked up a stray napkin and began nervously tearing it into tiny strips. After the Xylar completely evacuated the system, which by the way they did at record speeds, even sacrificing several capital ships to get their remaining forces out, the humans on Viridia Prime, they began to consolidate. They didn't just clear out the Xylar remnants, they systematically purged everything that wasn't immediately useful or entertaining. Xylar bases were dismantled for parts, often by simply smashing them with stolen Xylar heavy machinery that they had learned to operate by brute force. They built crude fortifications out of the wreckage. Our sensors recorded them setting up territories on the planet, marked by piles of Xylar helmets or strangely arranged rocks. And the funny sounds? Vorkus asked, a morbid fascination taking hold. Xylos shuddered. They became more refined, less random. They developed what we now call tribal calls and war chants. Our linguistic analysis indicated they were communicating complex ideas like, this is our territory, attack that shiny thing, and food is over there, using only guttural noises, slaps, and bizarre hand gestures. They held contests of strength and agility, displaying their prowess. It was like watching a species rapidly reenact its own primitive evolutionary history, but with advanced weaponry and a terrifyingly efficient, instinctual approach to survival. They even developed primitive art, Xylos continued, a tremor in his voice. We found crude drawings on cave walls, images of humans tearing apart Xylar, or engaging in rock-throwing competitions. Some even depicted scenes of consumption. It was disturbing, Vorkus, truly disturbing. And all of this, remember, was happening with what our readouts classified as suppressed higher brain functions. It means their higher intelligence, whatever it is they use it for, is simply not necessary for survival, communication, culture, or even basic technological adaptation. It's extraneous, a luxury. Ambassador Vorkus leaned back, a new wave of realization washing over him. So when the Xylar thought they were rendering them helpless, they were merely removing the filter? The layers of complexity that humans usually operate under? Precisely! Xylos snapped, his voice rising in frustration. They didn't break them, they unleashed them. They stripped away the civilized layers, the thinking layers, and what was left was a perfectly efficient, terrifyingly adaptive, and utterly brutal apex predator. It was the most successful military strategy ever, Vorkus, completely by accident, and completely unrepeatable by any other species, because no one else is like that. The Prions of Primal Power, Part 6. The real kicker, Vorkus, came a few weeks later, Dr. Xylos went on, his voice still hoarse. The humans on Viridia Prime, now fully entrenched in their feral state, began to affect the local flora and fauna. They hunted aggressively, cleared forests for their camps, and their sheer presence changed the ecological balance. And then, our sensors picked up something truly bizarre. Xylos leaned in again, his tone dropping to a whisper, as if sharing a secret that could unravel reality itself. Remember when I said they stopped eating the Xylar because some of them got sick? Well, that sickness wasn't just a digestive upset, Vorkus. Our deeper scans, conducted with new, experimental probes, revealed a unique protein structure in their bodies, a sort of primal prion. It wasn't a virus, not a bacteria. It was a misfolded protein that, when activated by extreme stress or suppression of higher brain functions, would begin to replicate, enhancing their primal instincts, their aggression, their physical resilience, and their ability to adapt to new stimuli on a purely instinctual level. It was like their bodies were literally rewiring themselves for optimal monk mode. This prion, Vorkus, also seemed to make them immune to lingering neural effects from the inhibitor, and even seemed to boost their primitive sensory perception. They could detect Xylar patrols from kilometers away, not through technology, but through an enhanced sense of smell, hearing, or even what some humans call a gut feeling. They became terrifyingly efficient hunters, their bodies producing adrenaline and pain suppressors at unheard-of levels. They were not just fighting, they were experiencing a primal, terrifying euphoria in the hunt. Ambassador Vorkus felt a knot tighten in his internal organs. So the inhibitor didn't just remove their higher functions, it triggered something in them that made them even more dangerous? Precisely. It was like hitting a berserker switch. And the Xylar, by using their weapon, essentially activated the ultimate countermeasure against themselves. It's why they fled in such utter terror. They didn't just face a loss of higher intelligence, they faced a self-optimizing, self-activating organism designed for pure, unthinking, brutal warfare. It was the ultimate return to monkey scenario, Vorkus, and it was a horrifying success. The Galactic Aftermath and the Monkey Marines, Part 7. And what about the humans who weren't on Viridia Prime? Vorkus asked, trying to steer the conversation away from the disturbing prion theory. The ones who sent the messages from Alexandria, offering more Marines for training exercises. Xylos sighed, rubbing his forehead. That's the second layer of this cosmic joke, Vorkus. The human coalition, their main governing body, seemed utterly unconcerned. When we contacted them to express our concerns about the feral state of their soldiers on Viridia Prime, their representatives just shrugged. They said, and I quote, "Oh, those are just our Marines. They tend to get a bit enthusiastic in the field, especially if there's a good fight. They'll snap out of it eventually. Probably. Maybe." They acted as if this was normal behavior. As if turning into a pack of cannibalistic rock-throwing barbarians was just a mild occupational hazard for their military personnel. We then questioned the human fleet admiral, a truly terrifying individual named Rax, who seemed to take a perverse joy in our bewilderment. He confirmed that their Marines undergo specialized training to prepare for extreme environmental conditions and, quote, unexpected tactical shifts. When I pressed him on the neural inhibitor's effects, asking how they could operate without higher brain functions, he simply looked at me with those unnervingly calm, yet utterly inscrutable human eyes and said, they're Marines. If they needed brain power, we'd issue it to them. Clearly, they didn't. And then he winked. A wink, Vorkus. As if he was sharing some inside joke that only humans, and perhaps a few particularly deranged apex predators, could understand. Vorkus leaned back, a low, rumbling chuckle escaping him despite himself. The absurdity of it all was finally cracking through his horror. So they essentially have a branch of their military that is trained to function without higher intelligence? Or rather, to function better without it? It seems that way. Xylos groaned, now burying his face in his hands. They call it, quote, combat instinct recalibration. We suspect they have some kind of psychological conditioning, or perhaps even a deliberate, if terrifying, genetic predisposition that enhances this primal response. They are a species that, when faced with a weapon designed to disable their minds, simply says, "Hold my beer, watch this," and proceeds to win the war by being more animal than the animals. The Xylar, by the way, have now completely pulled back from our sector of the galaxy, Xylos concluded, his voice muffled by his hands. They refused all further engagements, citing, quote, unacceptable combat variables, and, quote, existential terror. They even offered to pay more reparations if we just promised to keep the humans away from their borders. They are now building massive, planet-sized neural dampeners around their entire empire, not to attack, but to protect themselves from the possibility of another return to Monkey incident. The True Cost of Victory and a Galaxy's Bewilderment, Part 8, The Ending. Ambassador Vorkus pushed himself up from the table, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilarating, if morbid, revelation. The entire gala hall seemed to swirl around him, its joyous noise now sounding like a symphony of ignorant bliss. He looked at his friend Dr. Xylos, broken but perhaps in his own way enlightened. "So Xylos," Vorkus said, his voice quiet. "Our victory. It wasn't a triumph of our superior intellect or technology. It was a victory achieved because one of our newest, least understood members, when stripped of what we consider essential intelligence, became an unstoppable force of primal chaos." "Precisely, Vorkus," Xylos mumbled, lifting his head one last time, his eyes wide and haunted. "It's the ultimate HFY, isn't it? Humanity. Fuck, yeah. They prove that even without a brain, they can still win. And they'll laugh at you while they do it. Or, rather, make funny sounds at you. Then probably eat you." Vorkus managed a weak smile. "And what does this mean for the Coalition? For our future relations with humanity?" Xylos sighed, picking up the last remnants of the shredded napkin. "It means we have to reevaluate everything. Our definitions of intelligence. Our understanding of combat. Our diplomatic protocols. We can't integrate a species whose most effective military unit operates best when it's lost its mind. We can't go to war with them, because we now know their greatest weakness is also their greatest strength. And we can't fully understand them, because they use their higher brain functions for suffering, mostly." Ambassador Vorkus looked around the celebrating crowd. They were cheering, oblivious to the terrifying, hilarious truth. They thought they had won conventionally. They didn't know the humans had won by becoming something utterly monstrous, something that defied all logic and reason. "I need another drink, Xylos," Vorkus finally said, his voice now almost entirely humorless. "A much stronger one. One that will make me forget everything you just told me. And then, perhaps, a very long, very deep nap. One from which I hope to awaken with my understanding of the universe intact. And with the firm belief that monkeys are supposed to stay in zoos." Dr. Xylos, however, was already back to mumbling, his head once again resting on the table amidst the cracks he had made. "Damn apes. Where's my 1500 cycles, and my new definition of higher intelligence?" And so, my friends, that is the extended, bewildering tale of the Battle of Viridia Prime. A story not of technology defeating technology, but of something far older, far more primal, and infinitely more terrifying. It's the story of how the galaxy learned a profound, unsettling truth. You can try to take a human's brain, but you can never take away their inner ape. And sometimes, that's all they need to win, and then some. Beware the species that finds its greatest strength in the absence of thought, for they will make you question your own sanity. And they might just eat your enemies while doing it. They took our brains, we took their planet. Part 9. The news of the Xylar hegemony's panicked retreat from Viridia Prime spread like wildfire across the Coalition's vast communication networks. The official reports, carefully redacted and sanitized by various diplomatic corps, spoke of, quote, strategic withdrawal and unforeseen environmental factors. But whispers, carried on the sub-ether currents and amplified by every bewildered soldier and sensor operator, told a different story. A story of fear, of a technologically superior force abandoning a prized possession not because of a counterweapon, but because of a species that had literally gone feral. Ambassador Vorkus, after his traumatic conversation with Dr. Xylos, found himself thrust into the heart of this galactic confusion. The Coalition High Council demanded answers. They had won a decisive victory, yet no one seemed to understand how, or more disturbingly, why. The first emergency session was a cacophony of outraged squawks, indignant roars, and the rapid-fire clicking of various species' frustration. "Explain this Viridia Prime incident," demanded High Counselor Thrak, a massive, multi-limbed creature from the Gorok species, whose usual booming voice echoed through the council chambers. "Our intelligence indicated the Xylar neural inhibitor was impenetrable. Yet the reports state our forces, specifically the newly inducted humans, engaged and drove off the Xylar while under its effects. This defies all known combat doctrine." Dr. Xylos, looking even more disheveled than he had at the gala, was brought forward to present his findings. His voice, usually precise and academic, was now laced with an almost manic energy. He showed the council the raw sensor feeds, the humans hooting, screaming, throwing rocks, then eating the Xyle, followed by their terrifyingly rapid adaptation of Xylar technology. The council members, a diverse array of species from across the galaxy, reacted with a mixture of shock, disgust, and outright disbelief. A delicate trillion diplomat turned a sickly shade of purple, a sign of extreme nausea. A logical-minded Silurian began emitting high-frequency stress signals. They communicated through screaming, squawked a winged Aryan representative, flapping his delicate membranes in agitation. And then, they consumed the enemy? This is barbarism. How could this possibly lead to victory? Dr. Xylos, armed with his newly acquired, deeply unsettling insights, tried to explain. Counselors, the Xylar's strength lies in their rigid adherence to logic, and their reliance on overwhelming, calculated force. The humans under the neural inhibitor bypassed all logic. They operated on pure, untainted primal instinct. They became an unpredictable, chaotic variable that the Xylar's tactical algorithms simply could not process. Their simulations couldn't account for a foe that responds to losing its mind by becoming more effective. It's like trying to calculate the trajectory of a rock thrown by a hurricane. But the cannibalism? Interjected another counselor, their voice filled with revulsion. And the funny sounds? This isn't warfare, Doctor. This is a horror show. How could we possibly integrate a species that reverts to such disgusting behavior? Dr. Xylos threw his multi-limbed hands up in exasperation. That, counselors, is precisely the point. Their higher functions, the ones that govern etiquette, morality, and complex strategy, were suppressed. What remained was pure, unadulterated effectiveness. They adapted to their environment using only their base instincts, and those instincts told them to eliminate the threat, acquire resources, and establish dominance. The funny sounds were their initial form of communication and social bonding. The consumption was a desperate act born of primal hunger and perhaps territorial assertion. Our own observations confirmed it. And the Xylar were so terrified by this unpredictable, utterly illogical savagery that they abandoned their entire invasion. Ambassador Vorkus stepped forward, trying to bring some diplomatic calm to the proceedings. Counselors, Dr. Xylos's findings are, while unsettling, conclusive. The humans, or rather their Marines as they call them, possess an innate, almost terrifying adaptability. They are capable of functioning, and even excelling, in conditions that would render any other sentient species catatonic or mindlessly docile. This is both a profound challenge and perhaps a unique asset. The Unfathomable Marine Mentality, Part 10. The Council, still reeling, decided to hold a joint teleconference with a delegation from the human coalition itself. Ambassador Vorkus, fearing another mental breakdown from Dr. Xylos, advised against having him present. Instead, he arranged for a direct line to Admiral Rax, the very human fleet Admiral Xylos had encountered. The Admiral appeared on the main view screen, a square-jawed, stern-looking human, with eyes that seemed to hold both ancient wisdom and a mischievous glint. He looked utterly unconcerned by the gravity of the Galactic Council. High Counselor Thrak, after a moment of tense silence, boomed, "Admiral Rax, we have received disturbing reports from Viridia Prime regarding your troops. Their behavior under the neural inhibitor was highly unconventional, even barbaric. Cannibalism? Random violence? Communicating through guttural noises? Is this true?" Admiral Rax simply nodded, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk playing on his lips. "Yeah, that sounds about right. Standard Marine operating procedure, especially when things go a little sideways." A collective gasp went through the council chambers. Vorkus felt a wave of despair. "Standard procedure? Standard procedure!" squawked the Aryan diplomat. "Admiral, your troops reportedly ate the enemy. They tore them apart with their bare hands. They abandoned advanced weaponry for rocks. This is not standard. This is lunacy." Admiral Rax chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that seemed out of place in the formal setting. "Look, counselors, you hit them with a brain scrambler, right? Took away all their fancy thinking bits. What'd you expect? They're Marines. Their job is to adapt, overcome, and destroy the enemy. If their brains aren't working, They use what's left, and what's left is usually pretty effective. But the higher brain functions. Dr. Xylos, who had somehow managed to sneak into the back of the chamber, suddenly burst out. Our research shows. Admiral Rex cut him off with a dismissive wave of his hand. Oh, the eggheads and their higher brain functions. Doc, those guys are Marines. If they needed brain power, we'd issue it to them. Clearly for that particular job they didn't. They just needed to get the job done. And they did. Viridia Prime is liberated, isn't it? Zeller are running with their tails between their legs, talking about unacceptable combat variables. Sounds like a win to me. The Admiral then leaned closer to his camera, his eyes twinkling. Besides, you should have seen the after-action reports. One of them painted a Xylar on his helmet, with what looked suspiciously like, well, let's just say it wasn't paint. Another sent back a comm with just a picture of him holding a rock, and the words, "Return to monkey." They were having a blast. Morale was through the roof. The Galactic Dilemma, Integration or Isolation. Part 11. The council session ended in utter disarray. No consensus was reached. The humans, it seemed, were a strategic asset, unlike any other. But their methods were problematic. More than problematic. They were fundamentally incompatible with every known galactic ethical standard. Vorkus, High Counselor Thrak, rumbled later, pulling the ambassador aside. This human problem. We cannot allow a species with such chaotic tendencies to fully integrate without understanding them. But we also cannot simply dismiss them. They achieved what centuries of research could not. Indeed, Counselor, Vorkus replied, his mind still reeling. Dr. Xylos believes that their quote-quote higher brain function is, in fact, a filter. A filter that prevents them from unleashing their full, primal, terrifying effectiveness. He suggests that when it's removed, they become the ultimate weapon, but also completely unpredictable. And the primal prion theory? Thrak asked, lowering his voice. Is it true that they have a biological mechanism that activates their savagery? Dr. Xylos is still conducting tests, Vorkus admitted. But the preliminary data is concerning. It suggests their adaptability is not just mental, but deeply biological. They literally re-engineer themselves for combat effectiveness at a base level. The coalition faced a monumental dilemma. How do you deal with a species that wins wars by becoming uncivilized? How do you negotiate with a people whose admiral casually dismisses the need for brain power in his troops? Over the next few cycles, the coalition tried various approaches. They attempted to study human marines in controlled environments. The results were mixed. One marine, placed in a simulated inhibitor field, immediately began attempting to fashion weapons out of the observation equipment. Another tried to communicate with the observation drones by making what sounded like highly aggressive mating calls. They were quickly pulled from study. Diplomatic overtures were met with baffling responses. When the coalition proposed a treaty outlining strict rules of engagement, the humans responded with a series of animated memes featuring an ape smashing a computer, captioned, "Rules of Engagement, Ape Smash." The Xylar hegemony, meanwhile, had become obsessed with human-proofing their entire civilization. Their vast resources were now diverted to building immense system-wide, quote, anti-primate dampening fields, hoping to prevent another return-to-monkey scenario. Their fleets, once instruments of conquest, were now defensive patrols, constantly scanning for any signs of human expansion. They were terrified. The burden of suffering and a new galactic order. Part 12. The True Ending. Ambassador Vorkus eventually met with Dr. Xylos months later, the scientist having retreated to a secluded research station, his once brilliant mind now seemingly dedicated solely to observing the bizarre phenomenon of humanity. Xylos had aged, his segmented limbs moving slower, his eyes holding a permanent look of profound weariness. Vorkus, Xylos greeted him, without even turning from his data screens, which displayed complex neural scans of a human marine subject undergoing a stress test simulation. The subject was, predictably, attempting to break out of the simulation by repeatedly smashing its head against a wall. "Any breakthroughs, my friend?" Vorkus asked, feeling a familiar wave of dread. "Only more questions, Vorkus." "More horrifying questions," Xylos replied, his voice flat. "We've confirmed the primal prion." It's a latent gene, common in all humans. It activates under specific stressors, enhancing their base instincts and physiological resilience. It's a biological weapon, self-activating. And the most disturbing part? They don't even know it's there. Or if they do, they simply categorize it as getting in the zone, or going apeshit, as they so eloquently put it. And their higher brain function? Vorkus pressed, remembering the chilling words. Suffering, mostly? Xylos finally turned, his eyes piercing Vorkus. Yes, we've run countless simulations, we've observed them. It seems their quote-quote higher brain functions are indeed primarily used for complex emotional processing, for existential dread, for regret, for self-doubt, for boredom, for anxiety, for deep, profound philosophical suffering, all the things that make sentient life complicated and, arguably, less efficient in survival scenarios. When those higher functions are suppressed, all that suffering goes away, Xylos continued, a morbid fascination in his voice. And what's left is pure, unburdened, joyful effectiveness. They are free from the weight of thought, free from the complexities of emotion, free to simply be. And being an ape, for a human, means being an utterly devastating, unthinking, terrifyingly effective engine of destruction. Vorkus looked out at the distant stars, twinkling in the blackness. The galaxy was vast, filled with countless species, each with its own unique traits. But humanity was an anomaly, a species that became more dangerous when its mind was taken away, a species that used its intellect primarily for existential anguish, and its primal core for winning wars. The coalition eventually formed a new doctrine regarding humans. It wasn't full integration, nor was it outright isolation. It was a strategy of cautious observation and strategic deployment. Humans were to be used for, quote, unconventional warfare scenarios, situations where conventional logic failed, and a raw, adaptable, utterly savage force was required. They became the galaxy's last resort, its terrifying wildcard. They were given their own sector, well monitored, with strict non-aggression pacts that felt less like treaties and more like desperate pleas. Admiral Rax, in his final message to the coalition before withdrawing to human space, had simply sent one last meme. It was an image of a stylized ape, flexing its muscles with the words, "Problem solved, return to monkey, we're waiting." And so, my friends, the galaxy learned the ultimate horrifying truth about humanity. You can try to take a human's brain, but you can never take away their inner ape. And sometimes, that's all they need to win. In fact, it seems it's what they do best. They are the galaxy's wild card. It's unpredictable, terrifyingly effective, and utterly bewildering primal scream in the face of logic. They prove that sometimes the most intelligent thing you can do is stop thinking altogether.